Paris, 1314. On an island in the Seine, a man is being burned alive. His crime? It wasn't murder. It wasn't treason. And it certainly wasn't the occult rituals you read about in history books. His crime was becoming the creditor to the most powerful man in France. In other words, he lent money to the king, Jacques de Molay, Grand Master of the Knights Templar. Before his final breath was swallowed by the flames, he left behind the most expensive lesson in the history of finance. Never lend money to a king, because when the sovereign cannot pay his debt, he will liquidate the lender instead. The world remembers them as holy warriors, searching for the Holy Grail. But the raw truth is far more clinical. They were humanity's first financial giants. They invented the cheque, pioneered international wire transfers, and managed a balance sheet that would make Apple or JPMorgan envious. This isn't a dry history lesson about religion. This is a dossier on a banking empire, executed by its own largest client. The year is 1119. Jerusalem has been reclaimed, but the victory is a logistical nightmare. Thousands of Christian pilgrims are flooding into the Holy Land. They carry gold. They trek through thousands of miles of desert, and they are being slaughtered. To put it in perspective, traveling from France to Jerusalem back then was like walking through the heart of Gotham City at midnight with a suitcase full of diamonds. Except, instead of the Joker, you faced desert raiders. And instead of losing your wallet, you lost your head. The Catholic Church realized they didn't need more prayers. They needed a solution, a professional, armed infrastructure. 9 men stepped out of the shadows, led by Jacques de Molay, a French nobleman who wasn't necessarily the richest man in the room, but certainly the smartest. They called themselves the Poor Fellow Soldiers of Christ. Look at their seal, 2 knights riding a single horse, a masterpiece of medieval marketing. It screamed humility, sacrifice, and poverty. But never let the branding fool you. By projecting this image of holy austerity, they gained something far more valuable than gold: absolute trust. The church granted them total tax exemption and legal immunity. They became a sovereign entity with no borders. Within 2 centuries, the order that began with 2 men sharing a single horse would own more horses, more land, and more liquid capital than any royal dynasty in Europe. They weren't just guarding the road to Jerusalem anymore. They were building the first global operating system for wealth. At first, the Templars did exactly what was expected. They fought, they bled, they died in the desert for the faith. But this sacrifice bought them the most valuable asset of all: absolute papal privilege. Imagine a corporation today that pays 0 taxes, answers to no local laws, and takes orders only from a spiritual authority. That was the Templars. And this is where the financial miracle began. Pilgrims started asking, why should I carry gold across a desert filled with raiders when the Templars are already everywhere? The Templars smiled and replied, don't. The system worked like this. You walked into a Templar branch in Paris and deposited 100 gold coins. In return, they gave you a small piece of parchment, a letter of credit, encrypted with secret ciphers that only their inner circle could decode. You traveled empty-handed to Jerusalem, presented the letter, and withdrew your 100 coins. The world's first international cheque was born. They charged a service fee, usually between 2 to 4%. Sounds small? Multiply that by millions of pilgrims over 2 centuries. But that was just the surface. The Templars didn't let that gold sit idle. They did exactly what modern banks do. They invested it. They used their massive liquidity to buy up land, farms, and vineyards. They built a private naval fleet larger than that of Venice. They created a closed-loop economy. You deposited money with them, chartered their ships for your journey, and bought supplies from their farms along the way. By the early 13th century, the Templars owned over 9,000 manors across Europe, controlling assets equivalent to roughly 2% of the entire continent's GDP. Think about that. An entity that combined the banking power of JPMorgan, the private military of Blackwater, and the closed ecosystem of Apple, all backed by a divine get-out-of-jail-free card from God. The chilling reality was this. When kings needed money for their wars, they had to stand in line at the Templar treasury. And you see, when a sovereign has to ask permission from a group of monks to spend his own wealth, it's no longer about religion. It's about hidden power. By the way, if you're fascinated by how money and shadow power truly drive the wheels of history, subscribe now. Every week, we don't just tell stories. We dissect the empires that were erased from history, but whose legacies still haunt us today. In the world of high finance, there is a golden rule that every player in the game of power must memorize. If you owe the bank $100, that's your problem. But if you owe the bank $100 million and you command an entire army, that is the bank's problem. By the early years of the 14th century, King Philip IV of France, the man history calls Philip the Fair, was drowning in debts from which there was no escape. The amount he owed the Knights Templar was so vast that even the total tax revenue of the French kingdom was insufficient to cover the interest payments. In Philip's eyes, the Templars were no longer the brave protectors of the faith. They had become an existential threat. They were wealthier than him, more organized than him, and they held the promissory notes that could bankrupt his dynasty in a single night. Official history often claims that Philip destroyed the Templars because they worshipped idols and spat on the cross. But that was merely a meticulously staged lie. The raw truth is far more clinical. This was the bloodiest hostile takeover in human history, because when a debtor can no longer afford to pay, the simplest solution they often choose is to execute the creditor. Philip was a patient predator. He did not strike on impulse. He waited quietly until the political stars aligned in his favor. The year 1307 was the perfect moment for a purge. The Holy Land had completely fallen to Islamic forces years prior, leaving the Templars as warriors without a battlefield, bodyguards without clients to protect. This redundancy caused them to lose their legitimacy in the public eye, making them vulnerable to attacks on their honor. Even more devious, Philip successfully installed his own man in the most powerful seat of the spiritual world, Pope Clement V. Through political pressure, he forced the papacy to relocate to Avignon, right under the watchful eye of France. With the Pope in his pocket, Philip possessed the ultimate weapon that no financial institution could resist: the sanction of God himself. And then, at dawn on Friday, October 13th, 1307, darkness fell upon the keepers of gold. Philip launched a lightning strike with a precision that would make even modern intelligence agencies envious. Sealed orders had been dispatched to every corner of France, weeks in advance, with a single, ruthless instruction: at the very moment of daybreak, arrest every Knight Templar. In a single morning, the entire board of directors of the world's most powerful bank was thrown into dungeons. Their assets were frozen, and proud knights who had faced tens of thousands of enemies in the desert now collapsed under the torture of their own brothers in the faith. They were forced to confess to crimes they never committed, for Philip needed a legal pretext to seize their gold. In that era, heresy was an irreversible death sentence. But here is the most fascinating part of the conspiracy. When Philip's soldiers stormed the main Templar treasury in Paris to seize the legendary vaults of gold, they found only a room that was empty and silent. The capital had already fled. The financial system the Templars built was smart enough to smell blood in the air. Secret wagons had departed the night before, and their naval fleet at the port of La Rochelle had weighed anchor and vanished into the thick fog. They carried away the secrets and the vast wealth Philip so desperately craved. The King of France had killed the lender, but he would never touch the treasure. In 1314, as the Grand Master Jacques de Molay was being burned at the stake, he He screamed a chilling curse through the rising flames. He summoned both King Philip and the Pope to appear before God's court within a year. And as if scripted by a horror novelist, both men were dead within months. The creditors had passed into eternity, but the financial empire they created never truly ended. It simply retreated into the shadows, changed its form, and waited for the day it would return under a new identity. Where did the fleet that vanished into the fog at La Rochelle on that fateful night actually go? Official history leaves us with a blank page. But if you know how to observe the fingerprints left upon the map of global finance, the outlines begin to emerge. Many historians believe the surviving knights carried their secrets and their treasure to Scotland and, more importantly, to Switzerland, a rugged, impoverished territory at the time. Look at Switzerland today, a neutral fortress, isolated from the world's wars, home to the most secretive banking system on the planet. It was a migration of financial masterminds, where stone fortresses were replaced by vaulted security. However, the most critical legacy of the Templars did not lie in buried gold, but in the seamless transfer of power to the Italian banking houses. After the massacre of 1307, dynasties like the Medici in Florence and the merchant princes of Venice observed the fall of the Templars and drew a life-saving lesson: never build a fortress. The Templars' ostentation was their tomb. The Italian elite realized that if you hold the wealth of kings, you must not wear armor. You must wear the silk of a merchant. Do not stand on the battlefield. Stand behind the banshee, the money changers' benches. They absorbed the Templars' networks, but refined them into something far more sophisticated. Double-entry bookkeeping, cross-border letters of credit, and the Templars' economic intelligence network became the skeletal framework for the rise of the Italian houses. It was here that finance was civilized. They didn't need a papal blessing. They only needed absolute secrecy and ironclad legal contracts. The Italian families perfected the art of dominance. Without a crown, they funded both sides of a war, held the debts of both the victor and the vanquished, and transformed kings from absolute rulers into business partners. This was the birth of soft power, where numbers on a ledger carried more weight than 1,000 swords. The Knights Templar may have died at the stake, but their DNA is immortal. They were the first to understand that the sword and shield do not rule the world. The man who holds the ledger wins the final game. Today, we don't call them monks in armor. We call them asset managers, anonymous billionaires, or financial institutions too big to fail. The massacre of 1307 was simply an expensive lesson for the financial elite. Let the politicians stand at the front line and absorb the attention, while real power is kept in boardroom chambers and encrypted servers. History doesn't repeat, but it certainly rhymes. You think you live in a free nation? Look at your country's national debt. Look at who truly holds those promissory notes. Perhaps those knights never truly disappeared. They simply traded their white mantles for bespoke suits. They stopped carrying broadswords and started carrying balance sheets. And the most chilling question remains: if King Philip the Fair were alive today, would he have the courage to liquidate his new creditors? Or would he realize that he, too, is just a pawn in their game? Don't follow the headlines. Follow the money.